Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this Tokyo College webinar on the topic of the puzzle of vaccine hesitancy. My name is Michael Fatzius. I'm Associate Professor at Tokyo College, and I'm moderating the session for today. So I'm going to introduce the speakers for today in a second. First of all, let me give you some technical information about how this is going to proceed. We're going to have two talks by Professor Gordon and Professor Reich that introduces the issue of the history and problems with vaccine hesitancy and vaccine acceptance in Japan. And then we'll have two comments from Professor Goto and Utagawa-san from Tokyo College. And then we'll have, for the last 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how long everything takes before that, we'll have an open Q&A. First of all, we have Professor Andy Gordon at Harvard University. He's the Lee and Juliet Folger Fund Professor of History for Social and Political History of Modern Japan, mostly, also with very close ties to Tokyo University. He has been a professor here at Tokyo College last year. And secondly, we have Professor Michael Reich, and he's Taro Takemi Research Professor of International Health Policy. So he's a political scientist with a historical perspective, and he has worked widely on public health and also on issues of vaccines, for example, on the human papilloma virus and the vaccines that were, and the issues related to that in Japan. Both of them have a very long relation to Japan that harks back several decades. So they're in a very good position to give us from now on their view on why vaccine hesitancy is a thing. And I would like to start with asking Professor Gordon to start his presentation, followed by Professor Reich's presentation.
Thank you so much to the faculty and the staff of Tokyo College for arranging this, to Professor Haneda, to Mikhail Fascius, to Takahira-san in the office, who I got to know all very well last spring when I was a visitor at Tokyo College. And thanks to all of you in the audience, whether it's your evening or your morning, for joining us. Let me start out by explaining a bit as to how we got into this project. Michael Reich and I have known each other for decades as colleagues, as friends, but we haven't shared an overlapping research interest. We've never conversed about our research in a connected way before. We know what each other works on. But as somebody who was very curious about the progress or the situation of the COVID-19 vaccine in Japan, because I was there last spring, when I came back to the United States in July 2020, I continued to follow the situation in November, December, as the vaccine results of the trials were announced in the United States and spread around the world. I found the lack of attention to that development in Japan to be surprising. And so knowing that Michael is an expert on both global public health and also on public health in Japan, I sent him this email. What is truly baffling is the seeming lack of urgency by the government, that is the Japanese government, and low priority in media attention given to the vaccine. We as my wife and I, we watch the NHK morning news every evening because of the time difference. The NHK morning news on a Thursday morning will be Wednesday evening in Japan, in Boston. And in the past, we in the past few weeks, we don't think there has been more than 5 minutes total devoted to the vaccine approval process in Japan, and nothing on how it would then be distributed, or even an estimate of when approval would come. What on earth is going on? Later that day, Michael replied to me, as you know, did you see the paper in Lancet on vaccine hesitancy? Japan has a complex relationship with vaccines. I don't have a good sense of the history, but I have finished a project with some Japanese students, researchers on the HPV vaccine resistance in Japan. I wonder if these fears about side effects exist as well for the COVID vaccine. I don't have good answers and I don't have good information or ideas. maybe we can come up with some thoughts together. And so that was the origin of our collaborative research. As it turns out, I did not know about the Lancet paper on vaccine hesitancy. So I took a look at it. Here is a piece of it, this map. It's a survey that was done in 2018. And the key point here is that low confidence in vaccines or high hesitation about vaccines is the redder you are, the more hesitant you are. And Japan, you can see here, here, and here about all these measures, safety, importance, and effectiveness, ranks low. And so, okay, there's a story here, but what is the story? We decided to look into it together. For me, this project has taught me something about the pleasure of collaborative research that I didn't know, which is that it is a pleasure. It may sound strange to you who are in the social sciences other than history, perhaps, or in the natural sciences for sure, or in public health field. But collaborative research is not the typical thing in history. And I had never written a jointly authored paper until now in 40 years since my PhD. For Michael, that's the coin of the realm. That's basically what he does. He writes papers in collaboration with others. How different our disciplines are. That was one big discovery. Another pleasure and exciting challenge for me as a historian was to work on a project that had such a close relationship to a really quick evolving present. And the present day situation that frames our study is evolving in real time so rapidly. Our own project, our own paper and presentation today is not primarily about COVID-19. It's about the history behind the current situation. But we will address at the end a bit, or Michael will, the COVID-19 situation. And I want to just briefly note at the start here that the relevance of our research to the present has, if anything, become much more significant in the 5 months since we started working on the project. Here's a graph showing the rate of vaccination defined as people receiving at least one dose of any COVID-19 vaccine since December 19th, just about the time that I wrote to Michael. And you can see that nobody was doing much vaccinating at that point, but there was talk and there was the beginning of action in many places, but not Japan. Japan's first approval of the vaccine is not until February. And while this is Israel here, but the United States is in brown, you can see its progress. Now it's actually a little over 50%. I believe this data is 1 week old. And Japan is still languishing at about 4 to 5% vaccination. So what is going on? Here, we think there's a history to this story, and that's what we want to tell you about. Our initial expectation, certainly mine, and I believe Michael's, was that the current situation would have deep historical roots, but we made two unexpected discoveries. One, we did not find a long and deep history of hesitation. By that, I mean going back to the earliest days of vaccination in Japan or in the world. Rather, we found a much more recent medium term, about 60 or so years history of the emergence of mistrust of vaccines and hesitation about vaccines that followed an earlier history of relative acceptance, and that the earlier history was well in tandem with global trends. Our second unexpected discovery is one that I'm only going to tease here and let Michael introduce towards the end of his talk. Although vaccine hesitation and mistrust is a global issue today and has been for some time, we found the hesitation in Japan exists not in the expected places, perhaps, but in some unexpected places, not the same sorts of places one finds elsewhere. So please stay tuned to hear more about that. I'm going to talk about the history of vaccination in Japan up through the 1960s, and Michael will carry forward from then. The story starts in the late decades of the Tokugawa era, which ran from 1600 to 1868. And it was in 1820, roughly, that Jennerian smallpox vaccine was the first Western medical vaccine to be brought into Japan by the Dutch. And with growing enthusiasm among the practitioners of so-called Dutch medicine Rangaku in Japan, this vaccine spread in use fairly considerably by the 1850s and 1860s. There was skepticism, certainly, in Japan and globally about the smallpox vaccine. In Japan, the skepticism came from those who are called practitioners of Chinese medicine, or in Japanese, Kampo, which is to say Chinese medical traditions as they are practiced in Japan. For instance, a Kampo doctor named Ikeda Muke wrote in 1858 that vaccines were, quote, witchcraft that deceives the public. The logic here in Kampo thinking was that disease is caused by poisons that have to be expelled from the body, and that a vaccine would inhibit that. It actually introduces more poison into the body, and that was a wrong approach. So, and we see here a fear of foreign substances in multiple ways. Foreign, they come from outside Japan. Foreign, they come from outside the body. In the case of the cowpox vaccine, which was used, taken from cows to fight smallpox, it's from an animal to a human. So in multiple senses, a fear of foreign substances was part of the thinking here. At the same time, and this is not a big discovery by me, I found this by reading a number of articles and books that have been published on the topic. The spread of vaccination regulations promoting and requiring vaccines in Japan and the practice of vaccination for smallpox in Japan took place gradually but steadily through the 19th century into the early 20th century. And we find in Japan no major resistance to the smallpox vaccine at the level that took place in other countries. For instance, in Brazil, very famously, there were riots in the early 20th century against opposing the imposition of smallpox vaccines. In the United States, there was also major resistance. So from that start point, we find that in 1909, the Japanese government passes a law requiring smallpox vaccination. This graph shows you the dotted lines are disease numbers, the black lines are mortality, death numbers. And you can see that in the 19th century, before this law was passed, there were 3 major spikes of smallpox. And then another one in 1908, which provoked the law. And after that, although the vaccine was not universally imposed, even implemented, although it was mandated, not everybody got it. Many people did, and it was quite effective. There were a few spikes of smallpox in the 1910s and 20s. There was a spike immediately after World War II with a breakdown of Japan's public health system. But the overall story is one of a promulgation, promotion, and acceptance of the smallpox vaccine. And this trend continues through the 1920s of acceptance and even leadership in vaccination. We see this in the introduction into Japan of cholera vaccination from 1902, a few years even before the smallpox law. And cholera was an awful problem and disease in Japan as around the world. And the cholera vaccination was quite widespread. There were surveys taken at the time that show its high efficacy. We also find that typhoid vaccinations were implemented in Japan. These were voluntary. They were not mandated as the smallpox was. And in the 1920s, about 20% of the population annually got a typhoid vaccine, which in global comparative standards for that era was high. We also find that the Japanese were effective in producing and using vaccines, not only importing them. And a notable example of this was in 1919, 1920, in the case of the Spanish flu pandemic, where in Japan, the Japanese scientists, doctors, researchers came up with an influenza vaccine. It did not protect against the influenza virus itself. It protected against or fought off the pneumonia that was the main cause of death from the so-called Spanish flu. And this is a poster that was produced by the Japanese government at the time, by the Health Bureau of the Ministry of Internal Affairs or Home Affairs. And it interestingly drew on folklore or traditional folk thinking in this poster, which shows a doctor giving a child a flu shot or flu vaccine. And the caption here on the right reads, with this preventive inoculation, you can kick out from its residence the god of the wind. And the god of the wind is this evil figure in Japanese folklore, which in this case is carrying a bag called disease, and he is being expelled from his home of the body of this young boy by the vaccine. So, and it's interesting that the papers that told the story of these various vaccination efforts were being published in leading English language medical journals, as well as in Japan, including the results of Japanese innovation in vaccines. So it's a story of the late 19th century through the pre-war decades of acceptance and even leadership in the world of vaccines. Turning to the early post-war era, the immediate aftermath of World War II saw a surge of infectious disease in Japan for various reasons, as the public health system that had been built up before the Second World War, built up in the first half of the century, more or less collapses. Cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, diphtheria in particular were serious problems. However, as the Japanese authorities and public health world begins to put itself back together, even in 1946-47, vaccination resumes, and against these diseases begins to have some considerable impact. And then in 1948, the United States, which was the main power occupying Japan and seeking to reform or remake Japan, imposes on the Japanese government, which passes it through the legislature, the Diet, that is, the preventive vaccine law, the PVL. The United States imposes the PVL in June 1948. It was said to be, and I believe it was, the strictest such law in the world. It mandated vaccines for about a half a dozen major epidemic diseases, including smallpox and cholera and diphtheria. And it gave the government authority to, on a case-by-case basis, impose other vaccine mandates. And the man in the photograph on the right, Brigadier General Crawford Sams, was stationed in Japan as the head of the public health authorities of the occupation forces, and he was the proud promoter of this law. The law was respected and accepted, and vaccines were already being spread and accepted in 46-47. At the same time, we do see planted the seeds of backlash against this law, in particular through a sad, tragic disaster that took place just a half a year after the law was passed in November 1948, the so-called Kyoto Shimane diphtheria disaster. What happened was that in the rush to follow the American order, Japanese vaccine producers slacked off on their quality assurance efforts, and several toxic batches of the vaccine, the diphtheria vaccine, were produced. Vaccination was done to infants. 84 infants died from these toxic batches of toxic vaccines. Another 854 suffered long-term disabilities, such as paralysis. The story was, for the most part, suppressed. It got a bit into the press and was discussed a bit in the legislative body, in the Diet, but not widely. Modest compensation was given to the victims or their families, although many were dissatisfied with the amount. And so fury and anger at this tragedy remained below the surface to emerge again a few decades later. But overall, by this point, vaccination was well accepted and continued to be. And then we reached the peak, I think, of vaccine acceptance in Japan in the face of the polio pandemic or the polio, spread of polio all around the world, including in Japan in the 1950s and into the 60s. And to me, this moment of the promulgation or the implementation of a polio vaccine in Japan is the high point of vaccine enthusiasm among the Japanese public. And what's really interesting here, I believe, is that the impetus for the vaccine and for the import of this vaccine, because it was invented in the United States first by Jonas Salk and then by Sabin, two different vaccines, the so-called inactivated polio vaccine by Salk, the oral polio vaccine, which was easier to administer, but which could, in some rare cases, cause polio, very rare cases. Both of these were made elsewhere and would be imported. And the popular movement, the Japanese broadcaster NHK, the Japan Socialist Party, the women's organizations raised a tremendous, engaged in a tremendously strong campaign demanding the vaccine. And they were successful in forcing the government to allow the import of the oral polio vaccine in 1961 when the cases were rising. And you can see here in this graph that polio reaches one peak in 51 and then subsides some and then is surging in 59 to 60, 5,600 cases in 1960. And it's at this point in the spring of 61 when it looked like the summer of 61 was going to be even worse. In June, the government agrees to the imports. In 1 month, in July, I believe it was, or was it June? In 1 month in 1961, 13 million people were vaccinated. Compare that to the first month after the approval of the COVID-19 vaccine in Japan. It was really notable, and you can see the impact down to zero. So this is the high point of vaccine acceptance in Japan. At the same time, we see the beginnings of mistrust, the beginning of the end of this widespread acceptance across the board. And the story begins with the resistance of the government to importing the inactive polio vaccine, because by 1964-65, the Japanese vaccine producers were able to domestically produce the oral vaccine it had been importing until that time. And the government then said, okay, we're going to stick with the oral polio vaccine and not import the inactivated polio vaccine, which was not being produced in Japan, because the government, I believe, wanted to protect domestic industry. This generated a different kind of public opposition from people who wanted the imported vaccine because the domestic vaccine, in rare cases, we're talking about less than 1 in a million, but still rare cases, the OPV, the oral vaccine, could cause the disease. The government resisted this. Not until 2012 did the Japanese government switch to allowing the inactivated polio vaccine. So to sum up the first part of our presentation and my examination of the history up through the 1960s, we see some hesitation expressed early on towards smallpox, but similar hesitation had been expressed globally. We see the seeds of some later concern planted in the 1948 diphtheria disaster. But overall, I'd say we have roughly a century of acceptance of vaccines in Japan from the 1860s through the 1960s, and a peak in sync with the global excitement at the potential for public health systems and science to stamp out dreaded diseases. We see Japan in sync with this global trend, reaching a peak of vaccine support in the polio case of 1961. So let me stop there and turn things over to Michael.
Good. Thank you very much, Andy. 日本の皆さん、おはようございます。ハーバード大学の来志でございます。よろしくお願いいたします。So let me echo Andy's comments. It has been a distinct pleasure for me to collaborate with him on this project, and I think both of us have looked on it as a process of discovery which we're trying to share with you today. So Andy has taken us from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. I'm going to move from the middle of the 20th century to today. In the 1970s and 1980s, there began to emerge in Japan a series of vaccine problems. And these were not just isolated incidents, but they gave rise to social movements and associated litigation in ways that had not happened before. It resulted in a shift in public attitudes. It created a new vaccine era for Japan. And as I will explain to you, the government responded with major changes in the legal framework for vaccines in Japan. We're going to look at 4 distinct vaccine cases. So first, let's look at pertussis. Pertussis is a highly contagious respiratory disease. It comes from a bacteria. In English, it's also known as whooping cough. And in the 1940s in Japan, it caused an estimated 10,000 deaths a year. In the 1950s, there was a killed whole cell vaccine. So they deactivate the whole cell in some ways. And as a result of that, the incidence and mortality in pertussis dropped in Japan significantly, and there were no deaths by 1974. Still, there were sometimes rare, intense reactions that could occur from a toxic component in the pertussis vaccine. Usually it was administered in a combination called DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, to infants. Then in 1974-75, 2 infants died within 24 hours of receiving this vaccine in Japan. The government, in turn, responded by suspending pertussis vaccination, saying no more, and then restarting it instead of at 3 months, saying let's start the vaccine at 2 years. When it did that, cases and deaths rose dramatically for a while. And then the government supported the development of an acellular pertussis vaccine. This one had no side effects. That was introduced in 1981. And it led to sharp declines in cases and mortality by 1987. So the story of pertussis really shows 2 things. First of all, the effectiveness of scientific research and innovation in reducing risks associated with vaccines. And secondly, it shows the effectiveness of science-based public policies to reduce vaccine-related injuries. And if you look at this article cited below, they have a very nice graph showing the way that cases and mortality increased and decreased depending on the availability of the vaccine. In the 1970s, there started to be a series of vaccine-related injury lawsuits. Some of these started in the mid-1960s. Then in 1973, there was a group of 26 families that filed a suit against the government for negligence and damages for harms related to vaccine. This included polio, diphtheria, and influenza. And it was followed by similar types of lawsuits in several other cities in Japan. And it resulted in debates by Japanese politicians in the Diet. In this way, the social reaction to vaccines in Japan took a new form. It became based on a victims movement, people who said, I have been harmed from vaccines, with lawsuits against the government for negligence and damages. And it's similar to the kinds of victims-based movement that occurred for environmental pollution, such as Minamoto-byo, and food contaminations, such as Kanemi-yusho. So I was in Japan in the early 1970s, writing about Japanese anti-pollution problems and the anti-pollution movement. And this was happening at the same time. In turn, so there was pressure on the government from politics, pressure on the government from litigation, lawsuits, and pressure on the government from social movements. The government responded in 1976 by creating a no-fault compensation system for injuries associated with vaccines. So what this said is you didn't have to prove fault, you didn't have to prove negligence, you did have to demonstrate some degree of cause and effect. So Robert Leffler, who is a law professor at the University of Arkansas, has written about other administrative compensation systems that exist in Japan for what he calls medical misadventure, asbestos and other problems. And this compensation system is similar to those systems. It's also similar to no-fault compensation systems for vaccines found in 25 other countries around the world. So Japan shares this policy response with other countries in saying that it is partly the government responsibility to deal with unanticipated, unexpected harm related to vaccines. The second case is the measles, mump, and rubella MMR vaccine. This is a combination for 3 diseases. Japan approved it in 1987 and began using it in 1988 as a mandatory vaccine for children. As a result of this vaccine, there were some cases of aseptic meningitis that occurred, and they were attributed to a particular strain of the mumps vaccine called the Urabe strain that was used in Japan. When problems did occur, the cases were hospitalized, they were treated and cured with about 1 case in 500 to 900 vaccine recipients. The government response to this incident was to discontinue the combined vaccine and replace it with separate vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella. Eventually, they had one just for measles and mumps, measles and rubella, and mumps after 1994 became a voluntary vaccine. One expert on vaccines outside of Japan, Dr. Plotkin, observed that at the same time, there were other strains of the mumps vaccine outside Japan that had much lower rates of aseptic meningitis. But Japanese authorities, he wrote, quote, failed to allow licensure and importation of MMR vaccines containing the Geraldine strain, the one that did not cause aseptic meningitis, and one can only presume that this is protectionism in favor of indigenous manufacturers. He wrote that deafness follows mumps in approximately 1 out of 1,000 cases. So having mumps creates real health consequences. And he called the lack of vaccination against mumps in Japan as surprising for a developed country. So this kind of protectionism is similar to the case of polio that was discussed by Andy in the 1960s. In the 1980s, there were more decisions in vaccine-related lawsuits in favor of plaintiffs, and the government appealed. Then in 1992, the Tokyo High Court ruled for the plaintiffs, and the government moved to settle. The government began to consider changes to the legal framework, and in 1994, they revised the preventive vaccination law to change vaccination in Japan from mandatory, gimu, to recommended routine, teiki, and voluntary, nini. So this marked a major shift again in vaccination policy and vaccination attitudes in Japan. The third case we'll look at is influenza. In the 1970s, Japan was the only country in the world to adopt universal vaccination against influenza for school children. Other countries focused influenza vaccination on the elderly and vulnerable populations. But the PVL amendments in Japan in 1976 included influenza as a target disease and initiated mandatory vaccination for school children. This was based on the idea that if you could control transmission of influenza in schools, you could contain the disease in the community. and it was actively implemented, reaching over 10 million school children between the years of 1976 and 1987. But mandatory vaccination for school children provoked resistance by some teachers and parents. Some of the school physicians who were community doctors doubted the effectiveness of the vaccine. They said the students still suffered from kaze. Kaze is the word that's used to mean both cold and influenza. So this was a kind of what we could call linguistic and ultimately scientific misclassification. The vaccine was not intended to prevent the common cold. Yet studies were done by some community physicians, and they concluded that the vaccine was ineffective. This then became, once again, a social movement against the vaccine, and coverage declined to 18% of school children in 1992, and it ended in 1994 with the revision of the law. The fourth case we're going to look at is human papillomavirus and the vaccine for this disease. This was approved in Japan for use in 2009. It was followed by widespread use, up to 70% of girls between the ages of 12 to 16, and the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, the Korosho, recommended routine recommended vaccine in April 2013. After that, there were widespread media reports of side effects, and even though the cause effect was not confirmed scientifically, the ministry decided to remove what's called a proactive recommendation in June 2013, and that situation continues today. As a result, vaccine use dropped sharply. It's now under 1%, and cervical cancer rates are increasing in Japan about 2% per year, especially for women in their 20s and 40s. And it is a potential time bomb of cervical cancer for women in Japan. At the same time, routine vaccine coverage rates in Japan are high. These are free to people. And you can see from this chart reported by WHO and UNICEF, they're all over 90%. Many of them are close to 99%. It's interesting to note that the Mump vaccine remains voluntary in Japan, and coverage estimates are not reported by WHO and UNICEF, but there were 23,684 cases of mumps in Japan in 2018, compared to 2,515 in the US. So this leads us, in looking back over 150 years of Japan's history and its engagement with vaccine, to the complex pattern of past responses. Andy spoke about the striking history of official promotion, popular acceptance, even popular demand for vaccine that happened. At the same time, a significant history of vaccine mistrust, which goes back to the Tokugawa period. I've presented some themes related to the social mobilization of vaccine-injured victims as a form of yakugai. And each of these is associated as well with a growing sense of mistrust by people in the national health authorities. A sense of, can we really trust the government in what they're telling us about vaccines? Our main point is Japan does not have a simple history of vaccine hesitancy, and the portrayal of Japan as presented in the Lancet article as a country with low confidence does not fit the historical record and does not fit the current record with routine vaccines. Japan has a bifurcated two-part landscape for vaccines. On the one hand, high acceptance of the routine recommended vaccines, and on the other hand, low acceptance and slow authorization of some new vaccines, even if considered routine. So we came out of this feeling that sometimes it seems like it's Japan's health authorities that are hesitant about vaccines more than the public. So what does that mean for today and COVID vaccines in Japan? Well, it provides a historical context and historical perspective for the slow rollout and hesitant government response to COVID-19 vaccines. It also suggests that there may be and could be an emerging public demand for faster vaccination for COVID-19 in Japan. More broadly, history does not translate easily into public policy, but it is important, and we would say this to the current government, it is important to go back and look and understand Japan's history with vaccines, because it does shape understanding, it shapes public debates, and sometimes it shapes decisions, both personal and social. Japan has a complex history, sometimes engaging enthusiastically with vaccines, sometimes engaging reluctantly, and sometimes outright rejecting. And sometimes these three different patterns occur all at the same time. So we look forward to the comments from the two respondents. Our paper is forthcoming, as mentioned, both in English and in Japanese. The Japanese version will be out in医学のあゆみ, starting from the middle of June. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Reich and Professor Gordon, for these rich and insightful presentations, both on the level of historical developments of vaccination program and your analysis of the reasons for changing attitudes towards vaccines among the public. As Professor Reich just said, we are now looking forward to the comments. First of all, I'd like to call on Professor A.godo, who is a professor for health information and epidemiology at Fukushima Medical University.
Okay. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment on the insightful and very timely paper presented by Professor Gordon and Professor Reich. Let me introduce myself a little bit. I am an obstetrician gynecologist by training and currently work as a public health doctor. In Japan, we work with public health nurses to diagnose community using scientific data. As treatment, we prescribe health policy and community health activities. My interpretation of the paper are based on my field experiences in communities. I'll be using the same diagram when summarizing my comments. Well, to start with, there was an interesting roundtable discussion about曖昧or ambiguity among engineers that was in 1980s. Engineers are the ones who always aim for the best accuracy, and yet they discussed about an importance of曖昧. In the meeting, Professor Suda from Osaka University stated, "曖昧is a state in which we cannot predict consequences from the current situation due to our inability to understand too many underlying factors." And he also clearly stated that曖昧is a decision-making issue. So this, I thought, relates to the COVID-19 pandemic issue, complex issue, and my comment come from a question: what can we learn about health policy or decision-making for the current pandemic from曖昧described in the paper? Well, there are several contrasting perspectives presented in a paper that I found very interesting. First was as presented by Professor Gordon. It was tradition versus modern around 1850 to 60s. Campbell doctor criticized vaccination as a witchcraft. So it was Japanese tradition or purity versus modern foreign technology. As for the case of COVID-19 in Japan, we were really lucky to be used to wearing masks, which is one of the important preventive measures. But once the vaccine appeared, people became concerned with side effects of this new type of imported technology. So from this case, we need I can say that we need to accept and understand people's anxiety towards a new technology. Going back to the paper, about 100 years later, 2 cases of usage of science were presented. When a Japanese officer complained to GHQ that it is not good if people die from side effects, they were told that it was statistically inevitable that some numbers die. I thought that this case presents a case of science for top-down persuasion. As for the case of polio vaccine, NHK reporters started reporting daily new cases, which pressured the government to import oral polio vaccination. This case presents citizen or media usage of science for bottom-up approach. And this bottom-up approach was accompanied by citizen voices, especially from women groups. As for the COVID-19 case, statistics are reported daily, as well as side effects of vaccine. In 2020 survey, 66% of people were willing to be vaccinated. But in early 2021, the proportion decreased to 47%. Authors reporting this data speculates that media news about vaccine affects people's attitudes. This tells that information should be carefully shared by assessing information needs that are unique in the community, which may change constantly, as Professor Gordon says, evolving rapidly. Now I am moving on from the high point of vaccine acceptance to the area of rise of vaccine mistrust. In the late 1990s, self-protection versus social protection became apparent. People started to perceive vaccination as a method of self-protection in addition to social protection. And so, because of individual worries over side effects, some vaccinations were made mandatory or gimu to individual efforts or routine or teiki vaccines. Others became voluntary or ningi. One COVID-19 survey conducted in December 2020 reported that people's willingness to accept the vaccine was influenced by their peers and also legitimacy. Well, since COVID-19 vaccination is already designated as rinji sesshu, which is similar to teiki with full compensation. So at this point, I believe that reminding social protection role of this vaccine may increase vaccine acceptance in Japan. With regard to the case of influenza vaccine in 1970s, decision around protection versus prevention was very interesting. Flu control typically focused on the high-risk population to protect them from severe complications. However, in Japan, as Professor Reich already explained, that it first focused on school children. And this was prevention among a highly transmitted group. The same discussions goes for COVID-19 case, and this time we are starting from the protection side. However, for the school vaccination program for influenza vaccination, parents challenged this policy, and here we saw miscommunication around the word kaze. The flu vaccine was only effective towards flu, of course, but not cold. But both were called kaze in Japanese, which caused a confusion and misunderstanding about the effectiveness of flu vaccine. And this presents an importance of health literacy. So what can we learn from AIMAI of Japanese vaccine policy presented in a paper? First, when introducing a new technology, we should be ready to accept people's anxiety at first and be aware of health literacy and communicate in a way that is understandable to people, especially the health professionals needs to be aware of this point. And secondly, we should carefully share information for decision-making according to unique and constantly changing community needs. Third, now that COVID-19 vaccine is available as teiki sesshu, which is similar to 臨時接種, which is similar to 定期, we should emphasize an importance of its social protection role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Goto Sensei. Let's move right on to our second commentary by Uragawa Yoshie-san, who is a project researcher here at Tokyo College. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I am Yoshie Uragawa, and I'm a project researcher at Tokyo College, and I'm very honored to be here to be a part of this webinar today. And thank you for your presentation, Professor Gordon and Professor Reich. I'm not a historian or medical scholar, but I learned a lot from your research on vaccine hesitancy, and I found many similarities with my own research on media and public perception on juvenile delinquency. Your project beautifully described the historical context of different vaccine inoculation process and some of the negative results in Japan, including vaccine injured victims and cover-up. It also helped me to understand how the deep penetration of Campo philosophy together with the vaccine-related incident had a hand in generating and shaping public and official attitudes regarding vaccine hesitancy. I have seen lawsuits against pharmaceutical harm, yakugai mondai, while growing up, so I understand why the public is extra cautious about receiving any newly introduced vaccine, because they are particularly concerned about their side effects and not about the public benefit. You pointed out that receiving voluntary vaccine became an individual choice rather than mandatory, following the several yakugai lawsuits and the resulting new vaccine laws. And now people must pay for non-mandated vaccines. Excluding routine vaccines, the focus therefore shifted from public health and societal benefit to individual choice. My research area concerns the role of the media in policy making. And what concerns me the most with the vaccine hesitancy is that the voices of the medical establishment, such as doctors and researchers, were much less visible than politicians, media personalities, or the vaccine injured victims in the policy-making process in the recent years. Accordingly, proper knowledge and information about vaccine risk were not conveyed to the public. A very similar situation happened in Japan during the COVID-19 pandemic. The central government and the medical establishment had different or even opposing opinions in what measures to take, and that discrepancy was revealed to the public through the media. It seems to me that the medical establishment is gradually gaining more credibility and trust from the public, and their professional opinions are now more actively covered in the media. But now the big problem is the government and the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare are not trusted by the public. The vaccine rollout is slow, and the people are seeing daily news about the vaccine-related troubles. The mistrust in the government is growing, and the public anxiety is increasing. Some sociologists said that moral panic has been taking place in Japan since last year. Moral panic is a concept usually discussed in criminology, and it occurs when a condition, episode, person or group of persons emerge to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests, according to British sociologist Stanley Cohen. Moral panics are induced by external events that threaten conventional norms. For example, the moths in lockers in UK in 1960s induced a moral panic as they are considered threats, which was only heightened by the media. In Japan in the 1990s, juvenile crime associated the image of snapped kid, kireru kodomo, are considered another case of moral panic. Media plays a critical role in the development of social anxiety and the panics by using exaggerated and controversial imagery to make the events appear more scandalous. and thus amplifying fear in the public. I think it is important to note that the media and the public lack the perspective to articulate the actual cause of events from multiple angles, and they only focus on a fragment of the whole story. Let me explain with an example that when the Matsumoto sarin attack was conducted by the Om Shinrikyo Doomsday Cult in 1994, one of the victims was falsely accused by the media as a prime suspect in Japan. The media's excessive coverage of this incident, together with him as a prime suspect, made the public believe he was a perpetrator. He was in the media spotlight, and he received countless numbers of hate mail and death threats until the real perpetrators were caught. Stanley Cohen emphasized that the mass media is responsible for production of moral panics. However, it is important to understand that the mass media also has their own justice beliefs and agenda. And the real problem is that the mass media intentionally or unintentionally profits more from accelerating fear and anxiety rather than promoting proper understanding or encouraging a sense of security for the most part. In Japan, moral panic is particularly troublesome due to two factors. First, because of the strong historical credibility held by certain venerated media outlets like Asahi Shimbun or NHK, and because of the strongly known or tight society, once an idea is put forth, traction is quickly and strongly gained. The question is, the moral panic retractable? What is the cost? Will this credibility extend to social media outlets? I think your study will be one of the best examples in re-evaluating the role of the media in communicating risk management to society. I personally hope to see more transdisciplinary discussion between the media, policymakers, and medical professionals for reconsidering vaccine hesitancy and assessing the accuracy in reported information, as well as a gap between actual data and public perception. Lastly, I would like to briefly share the result of a recent public opinion poll on vaccine hesitancy conducted by Dr. Takayuki Harada from Tsukuba University. He collected 575 samples in mid-April and published the result in an online article on May 6. According to him, the vaccine hesitancy was a result of the anxieties around potential side effects, and that there was a significant difference across age groups. When examined separately by age, those in their 20s are significantly more likely to avoid vaccines and less likely to be vaccinated, while the opposite was true for those in their 60s and older. Dr. Harada said it was also notable that nearly half of those in their 20s want to wait and see what happens before making a decision. He concludes that vaccine hesitancy in the youth seems to be linked with their overall lower levels of anxiety around getting COVID-19 and more anxiety about the side effects of a vaccine. The NHK Broadcasting Cultural Research Institute also presented a national survey from May 21st, which suggested that the youth no longer watch TV and spend more time on the internet, including SNS and YouTube, which probably means that their main information sources are online. Careful inquiry is needed as to whether this correlates with a higher rate of vaccine hesitancy among the youth, especially as we are aware of the problems with fake news and misinformation in online spaces, such as vaccination causes infertility in women, or PCR tests are incapable of diagnosing any disease. It is important for medical professionals and policymakers to work with the media and devise a way to better communicate with the youth. Again, I wanted to thank you, Professor Gordon and Professor Reich, for your work on vaccine hesitancy. This will no doubt contribute to studies in other areas including, at the very least, sociology and media studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Professor Goto and Udagawa-san, for your comments, which introduced a couple of new factors and keywords like moral panic and IMI and the issue of media and the role of the media and literacy. So let me ask Professor Gordon and Professor Reich if you have any thoughts on these comments, any response from your side.
Sure, I'll start in with a couple comments, and then Michael, maybe you can pick up on what you want to. There's a lot that both Goto, Professor Goto and Udagawa-san have told us, so I can't pick up on everything by any means. I did want to say a bit about the anxiety, the last parts of Udagawa-san's comments. I think that my impression, and I haven't really studied this in depth in the United States and also in Japan, I should say that we're not in Japan now, and my access, I think, and Michael's access to Japanese media is limited. We have some, of course, through the internet, but not the same as if we were in Japan. But my impression, especially from the data you described, is that the anxiety, the relative willingness of older people to get vaccinated versus younger, and the relatively high concerns of the young or the less intense desire for vaccines among the young is probably not so unusual between the two countries. And that what I find more unusual is the hesitation of the Japanese authorities to promote the vaccine. And this is, I think, what we were pointing out with what we came away from with our own research, was that popular responses are in some ways notable in Japan for concern with side effects and for the pattern of legal action that isn't, I think, the same as found elsewhere. But what was really noticeable was how sort of defensive both medical and political authorities were in the face of that. And the media too. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a media-induced moral panic. I think that's a little strong. But I do think that the media in Japan has focused more, this is just I haven't done a systematic comparison, has focused more in its reporting on possible side effects than the American media has. Of course, there's been some discussion of it. So those are just a couple comments I have.
So let me pick up on that and relate them to a couple of the questions and also to the comments. I think one of the things that Andy and I both came away with was a sense that the Japanese government has not done a good job of managing social perceptions about vaccines. And this connects to what Goto Sensei described as health literacy. So it's an ability to explain risk, to explain science, and to do it in a way so that people understand. Although the survey does show that people over 60 do seem to be enthusiastic about vaccines. So I think this raises real questions about the role of government in society, both in terms of how it explains science to the public and how it uses that in a crisis to do a better job of managing public risks. And I think that this is going to have impacts in ways that we don't fully appreciate yet on the Summer Olympics. Though one person raised a question in the Q&A about the difference between the movement against vaccines in Japan and the movement against vaccines in the United States. And we talk about that briefly in our article. The movement in the United States is much more of a both philosophically oriented opposition to vaccines and religiously based opposition to vaccines, whereas in Japan, it is based much more on the people who have been affected or say they have been affected by the side effects of vaccines. And in the US, it's much more of a philosophical libertarianism. The government should not tell me what I should do and can't do, which has a strong roots in sort of the American cowboy mentality, and also some strong religious beliefs about vaccines. Andy, would you like to respond to another comment?
You know, I think that one of the comments from Mr. Tanaka, I believe it is, focuses on the unprecedented nature of the mRNA technology and the challenge in promoting this technology and its safety, given that it is new. And I do think this is an issue. I mean, I should say that my own personal physician in the United States, when I went for a checkup, a routine health checkup in December, and I asked him, I was planning to get vaccinated. He said, yeah, I think that's a good idea, but you know, this is brand new. The mRNA technology is brand new. And so, you know, I can understand people would be hesitant, and he's also curious about what will happen in the long run. So it's not an unusual response. I do think, though, that I believe that the risk benefit far leans towards benefit from taking these vaccines, from accepting getting these vaccines today, whether it's Pfizer or Moderna or J&J or AstraZeneca or whatever. And for whatever ones have passed rigorous evaluations, and that the evident success of the vaccines in many countries, including but not only the United States, in bringing under control the extent of infection is probably going to speak loudly to many people who are uncertain. Not to everybody, of course, but to many. And so for me, the outlook on coverage in Japan will probably not come down to what the government says, although the government could do more, I think, to communicate clearly, as both commentators have suggested. But I think it will come down to perhaps what the media says and what people perceive as they look around the world and also look at what's happening in Japan. It's a very strange situation where now countries around the world which are able to implement the vaccines are seeing less disease, more ordinary daily life, a return to something like normal, and Japan is going in the opposite direction. I do think that has shifted perception somewhat, and it'll probably continue. At least that would be my amateur estimation.
Let me respond to some of the questions about HPV vaccine. And I think that in some ways you could look at the media response to HPV as something similar to what Udagawa-san talked about in terms of moral panic. In a sense, it is something that the mass media has encouraged and created a kind of social anxiety that even the government is perplexed about what to do. And it will have and is having real health consequences for women in Japan. I think it raises questions about who is responsible for protecting women's health in Japan. Why has the government not done a better job? And fundamentally, it gets down to questions both of the, which a number of the questioners raised, the mistrust in government and the difficulties that the government has had in creating more trust in what it says and what it does. And questions about how can you encourage more, shall we say, even-handed discussion in the media about scientific uncertainty and risk. So these are fundamental questions in democracies around the world. And I think that with the rise of social media, it's even more difficult to have their deep, profound questions in societies about the role of government in controlling debate, shaping debate, who sets the limits, and how you shape perceptions. Andy?
Yes, Mikhail, you know, I've been reading as best I can, but there are about 18 questions, and I haven't had a chance to read them all. I've picked up a couple, but are there any that you've noticed that you think are particularly relevant to the presentation or to your interest that you'd like to point me to?
Absolutely. I think that, so there's two lines of thought that I saw in the comments that seem to connect very well to what both of you were just now saying. One is, I think it's something that especially Professor Reich could speak to, is the question by Mr. Sugawara. The question about, so we've been talking about government and media, but in his comment, he's writing, I'm currently supporting discussion with multi-stakeholders on how to transform vaccination policy in the life course approach. However, I think we need to move one step back from medical and health professionals discussion to a broader theme with other actors, and which other actors to be involved in the discussion. So what are critically missing agents in the discussions apart from government, and like from a public health perspective, like who are the stakeholders who also need to be involved?
So I think, you know, one of the things that the COVID pandemic worldwide has done is it's turned the whole world into a public health classroom. So everyone is learning about epidemiology, it's learning about risks, it's learning about regulation. It's not always drawing the same conclusions. It's learning about vaccines and how vaccines work. So I would say, in response to Mr. Sugawara, that you know, I think there is a need for a broad social discussion involving the private sector in Japan, involving social movements, involving actors, really involving athletes, involving media stars. There really is a need for a broad social discussion, both about COVID, but more broadly about how to deal with social risks that occur in modern current society. And this really is an opportunity to rethink some of the assumptions and some of the policies. And I would add that I think that politicians have a particular responsibility in helping to shape that debate. It really is helping to bring the level of health literacy up in all sectors of society, including the leaders of different social organizations. Andy?
Yes, I think, you know, the point about the whole world becoming a classroom of public health reminds me about what happened a decade ago and since, in which the whole world, and certainly in Japan in particular, actually, and the people who are interested in Japan around the world, suddenly became a classroom on the impact of radiation on people after the Fukushima disaster. And the kind of citizen science mobilization was really important then. And that was, I think, an even more challenging situation for authorities, since there was a division between the government's desire to support nuclear power and the public horror at the evacuations from Fukushima and the loss of community and a fear of radiation. And that created a situation where there was a highly oppositional relationship between the citizen science and the authorities. I don't think, though, that that necessarily has to be the same in this case, because I think the interests of the various participants and stakeholders, from ordinary citizens to medical authorities to government, should be more aligned. There is not a divide on the merits of vaccination anywhere near the extent of a divide on the merits of nuclear power. So it should be possible, I think, but Michael knows much better than me, for the world, a wider world of stakeholders to play a role in promoting the vaccines.
Thank you. I also wanted to, if it's okay, while you are also checking out the other comments, I wanted to highlight another one that I think is, of course, very relevant in this kind of international webinar we're doing right here, and your perspective as non-Japanese on the Japanese discussion. So we had a couple of comments relating to, like, what is special about Japan, right? I think Mr. Saito, I guess Michio-san, wrote about, like, the attitudes are not so different from those of France. They don't seem to be so special about Japan. And then we had another comment which related to by Mr. Akiyama Yoshio-san about the historical like specifics, if they are, to what extent are they related to Japanese kokuminsei, also to, like, to national character of the Japanese. So I guess cultural, historical aspects that you haven't picked on so much. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what is so special about the response?
Yeah, I mean, those are challenging and important questions. I'll jump in, but I also know that Michael and I have exchanged some thoughts on this topic, so I want to hear. Michael will also jump in, I'm sure. My view, especially in the first comment you introduced, is absolutely correct. It's Lancet said it's not only Japan that has low vaccine confidence, it's France, and it was Mongolia and a couple other places. And my impression, without knowing the French situation very well, or the other low confidence countries even a little bit, is that, and just thinking more broadly, is that vaccine hesitation is found all around the world and is high in Japan, but the particular configuration of it is different. And in particular, the configuration around social movements on behalf of the victims of side effects, and a kind of confluence of that with the movements that Michael was studying back in the 1970s of the pollution victims, and how similar those movements are and how conjoined they were. And that's something that I think is distinctive, even in a world where vaccine resistance is found elsewhere. And so then the why question is this kokuminsei. I mean, I'm very skeptical of arguments that will rest too heavily on a national character. And to the extent that one does talk about it, I think it's historically framed and it can historically change. To give a totally unrelated example, you would have said that the Japanese national character was highly militaristic, and Bushido and fighting was the essence of Japanese culture in the 1930s. But by decades later, you would see a kind of horror and aversion to war. So national character can change. And I think it's historically formed. And I think the particular timing of the emergence of pollution and pollution victims movements in Japan at the same time that the vaccine side effect victims emerged, and then the sort of exchange of tactics and ideas, and then a similar government response, has produced this complex or confluence. And then it becomes a characteristic of the nations. So I wouldn't necessarily call it kokuminsei, but it is a characteristic configuration of Japan. But Michael, what do you think about?
So this is actually something where Andy and I largely agree. We are both sort of, skeptical of this idea of some innate Japanese spirit that is somehow against vaccines, for example. And in fact, the whole point of our talk in our essay is that it's not that way. There actually are multiple different reactions, and sometimes you have different reactions occurring at the same historical moment of enthusiasm, rejection, and skepticism. And I think that that we both have the sense that these are fundamental human reactions. You know, that human beings have these kinds of reactions to different situations, whether it's a vaccine or uncertainty or risk, but they get expressed in particular forms that are available within certain cultural contexts. So that there are certain symbols, there are certain ideas that resonate within Japanese culture. And the example that Andy showed of the poster that was used in the 1920s to promote vaccination, with a cultural symbol there of what was being done to get rid of the evil spirit of the cold. So I think by nature, both Andy and I look for the universal patterns and the ways in which they get expressed in particular forms within a society. And just to give one more example of that, there was one of the questions about the relationship between the center and local authorities in Japan with regards to policy, the kuni and chiho, and the confusion about who's in charge and to what extent can local governments have different policies and how much do they have to listen to the center. Well, we know that phenomenon very well in the United States, and we've seen it in extremes with regards to COVID, and we saw it in even more extreme under the previous administration with President Trump. So this again is a phenomenon that occurs in societies and gets expressed in different ways depending on how the political system works and what kinds of dysfunctions are built into the system at that time. Mikael, was there something else you're on mute?
I just realized. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for one last question, and for your responses to one last question. And I think one that came up from several commenters and that is kind of oriented towards the future is the question of Japan's capability and need to develop its own vaccines. We had both a question by Shimoda Atsushi-san and by Suzuki Nobuhide-san in this regard. So what can we do to get the government to encourage research and development of possible future vaccines? But also, is there a necessity for Japan to have its own vaccines, especially in relation to hesitancy? Any thoughts on that from your side by way of conclusion?
Yeah, I think we both will have thoughts. We've discussed this some. Takemi Sensei, who's the son of the Takemi Sensei who created the program that Michael founded at Harvard, was the founding director at Harvard. The Takemi Fellows Program is very big on also promoting domestic production of vaccines. I have mixed feelings of this. On the one hand, I feel puzzled that a country with the medical technology, the talent, and the money to the extent of Japan has not generated a vaccine. I just learned the other day that Cuba, a country with 12 million people, that is the entire population of Cuba, is about the population of Tokyo, has developed its own COVID vaccine, which is beginning to be rolled out in Cuba and will be exported, I think, with political intent to some countries around the world. And the trials are at the rate of 80% efficacy, which is pretty good. If Cuba can do it, why can't Japan? Is baffling to me, and I think it is a political decision not to invest in this area of medical science over the years, but Michael will know better than me about that. Having said that, I think it's a big mistake to think that the only good vaccine is your own vaccine. I think that's a horrible stance to take, and very few countries in the world invented vaccines for COVID-19 up until now, maybe about a half a dozen, and many which had no developmental capabilities are aggressively importing and administering the vaccines, and they're having good results in the protection of the public. So this aversion to this reluctance to import, the insistence on trials that work on Japanese bodies, this I think is a big problem.
So I agree with Andy. On the other hand, if the solution to vaccine hesitancy by the Japanese government's hesitancy, if the solution to that hesitancy is building a domestic industry, and if it's part of a process of creating greater social understanding and scientific and health literacy in Japan, then I say do it. The bigger problem is mistrust and misunderstanding in science. And as long as it doesn't lead to an increase in vaccine nationalism, if it's part of a vaccine internationalism, then I think it makes sense. But I think it needs to, at the same time, deal with some of the more troubling and fundamental problems that our research on the historical legacies has turned up.
Thank you very much for these final statements. And I would now like to wrap up this session because it's time is over. And I would like to thank again, first of all, Andy Gordon and Michael Reich for their excellent presentations and for sharing their insights with us about vaccine hesitancy. I'd also like to thank Professor Goto and Udagawa-san for their comments. And I'd also like to thank the audience both for staying with us and for your excellent questions that added a lot of different perspectives to the discussion we already had. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.